Today, as I mentioned, our church celebrates a feast of the Chinese martyrs, and often there's one sort of elevated. But these martyrdoms took place between the 1640s, the first evangelization, or some of the first evangelization of China, at least the first martyrdom, up until 1930. That's a long period of time and over 100 souls. But it's Pope St. John Paul II recognized them and canonized them all in the year 2001. And then there's often one highlighted, who usually one who is a national martyr, a Chinese man. All of the companions, though, they say martyr and companions, all of the companions are, some of them are European missionaries, and some are native Chinese. And St. Augustine Zhao Rong, R-O-N-G, Augustine Zhao, he was a soldier, actually, who was charged with the duty of escorting one of those martyrs to his demise. You know, so he was doing the emperor's bidding. And that martyr was a bishop. In fact, let me see if I got his name. I don't think I have his name here. But a French bishop. And he, as a soldier, he was so inspired with the courage of this bishop that it started working on his heart. Seeing him first as an enemy of the emperor and a sort of a Western influence, like others who were trying to colonize China, they associated the church with that same colonization mission, unfortunately. So he just saw that at first, but he was so inspired by his courage and thought something else is going on there, and it worked away at his heart. Eventually he converted to Christianity and then was ordained to the priesthood and served generously as a priest in China until his own martyrdom. That's St. Augustine Zhao, his own martyrdom in 1815. So as we remember their courage and their witness for the faith, let us acknowledge our sins and ask God's pardon and peace, that we may grow in our resolve to witness to the faith, to proclaim the gospel. During my time as a high school student, I had a growing faith and thought, you know, I should get involved in the parish somehow. So I thought, I'll volunteer and I'll teach religious education. I can do that. And the little opening they had where they needed somebody was for 5-year-olds. I thought, how hard can that be? They're just 5. I had no idea what I was in for. And, you know, also being an undisciplined teenager, I wasn't really good at preparing the sessions. Regardless, you know, I would go there and realize I had no management skills over these 5-year-old kids. They were in charge, and they probably knew it. But the scary incident one day was when one of those little boys decided he wanted to be with his mom and dad, and so he left the classroom and started walking down the sidewalk. It was still on the same property, but between the classroom and where the church was, this is a couple hundred yards, apparently 300 yards. It was a long way, and I thought, oh my goodness, you know, I lost one, but I can't leave the group. But then what do I do, you know? And I learned really quickly that if I try to pursue the little boy, he would keep running further away and look back. And then when I would kind of pretend like I'm going back to the classroom and giving up, then he would feel insecure, and so then he would start moving back toward me. So I thought, okay, I got to figure this out. I was horrified. I thought, oh my gosh, if the parents come back and I've lost their child, oof. So I ended up, that trick worked, where I would just pretend like I was hiding behind a post and wait for him to come back and say, hey, come on, let's go to the rest of the way. And then hopefully all the others were still there when I got back. Oh man. Nightmares about that. And I tell you, it scared me from ever wanting to teach religious education again in my life. I got over that somehow. But still, notice this little thing though, the psychology of that. If I pursued the boy, he went further away. If I backed off and acted like I didn't care, then he wanted to come back. Listen to what we hear where in this prophet Hosea, what he's saying here. he says, I sought you. Let me see. You were okay, yeah. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. The more I called them, the further they went from me. Isn't that interesting? The more I called them, the further they went from me. One place where we see this obviously is parents of children, adult children who've left the faith. And the more you talk to them about it, the less they want to talk about it. And you realize, that's not working. And sometimes that's just the case because we want to figure it out ourselves. And then when they come to, if they do come to their own spiritual awakening, then they're interested suddenly. But it's just this weird cat and mouse game. It's a peculiar thing. Did you recognize that first line too? It says, out of Egypt I called my son. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. This is looking back to the time of the formation of Israel under slavery to the Egyptians. They found their voice. Moses was that voice and pleaded with Pharaoh, and they were released. And they really gained an identity as a nation in the desert. And the 10 Commandments were given to them. So that's the infancy of the nation of Israel, if you will. So that's looking back. Out of Egypt, I called my son, liberating them. And then it's also a prophecy. Do you remember when the King Herod wanted to kill the Christ child in the Gospel of Matthew, and so the Holy Family escapes to Egypt? And then when they return, it says, because the prophet said, out of Egypt I have called my son. So it's a prophecy of what's going to happen to Christ. Well, we're constantly being called as children of God to be faithful to God. And that's the infancy thing, to listen to that beckoning and open our hearts to it. Rather than say, my will be done, and kind of run away from God, we're called to be open to how God is calling us and to drop our guard and our defenses before the Lord and listen and see, what is it in my heart that I don't want to give over to the Lord? What am I running from? What is it that I need healed or that I'm afraid I'm going to give up if I completely entrust my life to Christ? So that's that coming back and forth. But once we embrace that, it's amazing what the Lord can do for us. St. Ignatius of Loyola says this, you just take a log and it doesn't look like much, but in the hands, if that log submits completely to the hands of a sculptor, a beautiful thing, a work of art can be carved from it. But they have to submit to the sculptor, and the sculptor's going to chip away at some stuff, and we're afraid of that. But that's what Christ does, and then beauty emerges that we didn't know was there. And so that's what Christ does for us. And these Chinese martyrs, wow, they show that beauty in a tenacity for the faith amidst every opposition. Now, some of it was confusion politically, where the emperor and the Chinese often thought this was just the colonists coming in. But the church, unfortunately got linked with that political agenda of the colonists. They were there just to let people know about Christ. That's all they were there for. And even though they were under great adversity, they continued to speak the truth of who Christ was. Listen to some of the heroes of this. Young Anne Wang, a 14-year-old girl, withstood the threats of the torturers who invited her to apostatize, to deny Christ. Ready for her beheading, she declared with a radiant face, "The door of heaven is open to all." 3 times murmuring the name Jesus. And an 18-year-old, I'm saying these names wrong, Zhi Guizi, cried out fearlessly to those who had just cut off his arm, and they were preparing to flay him alive. And he said, "Every piece of my flesh, every drop of my blood will tell you that I am a Christian." Incredible courage. And then, of course, the saint that St. Augustine Zhao, who was inspired by the humility and courage of this bishop who was led to his death, and he witnessed that, and it converted his heart. And then he proclaimed that faith as well and suffered martyrdom, but served the Lord as a priest against great adversity. It was inconvenient. Maybe it's better to wait for a better time when people might be more open. Well, no, the time is now. and we're called to proclaim it. So Christ is calling us. He can do amazing things in our lives and bring out great heroism in us if we submit to his will. But that's the tough thing, isn't it? But he keeps calling us. And so I think the spiritual life for all of us, for me too, is consistently putting ourselves in the presence of the Lord and say, open my heart, lead me, Lord, and give me the humility to follow you and not my will.